Give me money, give me money, give me money, give me money, give me money.
Friendship is Magic finally ended last year, not with a bang, but with a whimper. After 10 years of watching what was once a cute, fun, easygoing cartoon about tiny horse puppies being friends, turned into a pit of wasted world building and gloomy melodrama, I find myself ruminating on My Little Pony's slide down into the spiked pit of edgy man-children fantasy adventure show. These are my clustered thoughts on that, and animation as a whole this last decade. Yes, I know ContraPoints had a public meltdown over minor consequences for her shitty behavior. We're doing this instead. So where to begin? Friendship is Magic is a show that kicked off the animation Silver Age. Some say it was Adventure Time, but that wasn't what really supercharged the TV animation industry. I use the word Silver Age reluctantly because when it comes to animated shows, the vast majority of the new 10s were fucking awful. Shows bloated by pretentious waffling, hyperfixations on world building, a desperation to be the next Avatar that became so cloying that even Avatar's own creators tried to get in on it and failed, and a conga line of persistently bad tropes that writers refuse to let go of, even as they prove time and time again to actively kill their own shows, but pressing on anyway because the few dozen man-children still slavishly devoted to it were applauding the systemic suicide of everything they claim to be fans of. It wasn't a Silver Age, it was a Dork Age. The thing is, for a while, Friendship is Magic was the show that avoided this crap. While the fandom was always a big issue for the show staff, they did manage to always remember that there was a reason they were fans in the first place and keep making material that brought them in, usually with minimal pandering. Pandering was there and it was annoying, but it wasn't aggressively common. It wasn't until the map was introduced that things started to get iffy, because all the map actually turned out to be was an excuse to brute force a reason for the main six to be somewhere else while the problems were happening. Suddenly, friendship problems became the norm. You see, Friendship is Magic always seemed to have an issue with the moral of the story and how they were actually going to deliver it. At first, it was basically just letters to Celestia after a typical slice-of-life story about interpersonal relationships. And here's the rub, that was fine. That was perfectly serviceable. Because of how interpersonal relationships work, they could have sustained the show in perpetuity on that basis alone. The only real improvement that was made to it was establishing that everyone could write to Celestia so they didn't have to force Twilight into every episode. Once that happened, that was it. That's the perfect formula for a show. It's malleable, it gets the message across to kids, and it keeps the writing at a grounded area where it works best. So what happened? They kept fucking with it. If you've been in the Brony fandom for more than a year, you're probably familiar with and sick of this phrase, world building. World building is the great big clumping foot of nerdism, the compulsion among some to exhaustively survey a place that isn't there. It's when you spend a ton of time working out the lore and minutiae of your fantasy world, but keep forgetting to put stuff in it to actually happen. This wouldn't be a problem if it weren't for one little issue. The Brony fandom overemphasizes world building. My Little Pony is not Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. It's a show about characters, and the world is effectively the town they live in. There's only so much you can actually develop because the show is basically a sitcom. But Bronies, especially critics in the fandom, have never really been able to accept that because a sitcom is simple and not really worth exhaustively obsessing over, even though sitcoms remain the most popular genre of television ever. Bronies kept trying to twist and mutate it into being an adventure show about Equestria. Not about its main cast of characters learning to not be jerks, but about the map and filling in more and more of it. It started with demanding new villains when the tradition was premieres and finales. Hell, season 1 didn't even have a finale villain, and instead it was all about the girls learning that royal parties suck. There was this constant push and pull between the show's functioning and workable formula as a slice-of-life sitcom about simple interpersonal relationship issues and the kind of deep lore adventure saga that the adult fanbase wanted it to be. And that was a struggle the show was winning for a while until all the experienced writers and producers left. Why was this a problem? Well, we'll get into it a bit later, but aside from the fact that changing directions like that mid-series is a huge alienation risk, it also didn't suit the show's established goal. A show about interpersonal relationships doesn't work if you stretch out beyond the very personal world and into a global government. Values that work for children dealing with conflicts with their friends cease to hold any water when you start dealing with global threats and government tension. You probably remember I said the same thing about Steven Universe. The show wants to be about forgiveness and second chances, but decided to apply a kindergarten-level understanding of that concept to areas far outside its wheelhouse. Steven Universe's big critical mistake wasn't so much trying to be about forgiveness, it was trying to desperately cling to that ideal even when genocidal tyrants came into the mix, and also getting forgiveness backwards. The solution is pretty simple. Pick one. If you're going to claim to be about forgiveness, don't include genocidal dictators into your story. It's a really easy concept. This was the same problem Friendship is Magic ultimately had. It wanted to branch out and explore the world to appease the adult fans and have new big villains because that's what the adult fans like, and then deciding to stick to the premise of being about friendship, which results in the obvious, hastily rushed redemption arcs where the villains accept friendship into their hearts and all is forgiven.
Not a great plan.
As a result, the show became less about teaching lessons and more about preaching. And not preaching in a good way, like Zootopia, in a bad way, like enlightened centrism. You see, the shift to a political environment could have worked if they actually made that shift the whole way, but instead they took the childish values with it. Now friendship became Equestria's main religion, with Twilight as its pope.
Friendship didn't fail me. I failed friendship.
What the fuck does that mean, you mashed potato? Before, friendship was magic because strength in numbers always works better than doing everything yourself. That was the lesson that Twilight had to learn in the first episode. Now it was something you had to put your faith in, like the Force. It had no tangible reason for existing anymore. It was just something you believed in. A big symptom of this was that the show stopped teaching conflict resolution outside of Fluttershy episodes, which I could argue is the single most important skill to teach children. Friendship is now something you offer and maintain by keeping everything quiet and not rocking the boat too much. This wouldn't be an inherently bad idea if the writers had understood what they were working with and created an environment where toxic, hostile, and abusive relationships and people no longer existed, but yeah, they forgot that part. The show tacitly encouraged children to disregard their own safety and always extend a hand of forgiveness to people who make excuses for their bad behavior, a trend that would become infinitely worse as time went on and more shows followed in MLP's footsteps. And this was something that went unacknowledged by much of the community because, 1, bare-bones villains with Freudian excuses or bad reasons for doing things are currently making average audiences bust a nut with how supposedly complex they are, like it's some kind of requirement. 2, brony behavior indicates that the themes of the show went completely over their head, probably because they were too busy mapping out the world and busting a nut over background characters and also children. 3, modern cartoon fandoms are completely indifferent to what is and is not healthy for children in shows aimed at children because they view children with absolute giggling contempt. Friendship as a concept became more and more about having friends and keeping them, not having good friends. Early in season 1, there was an episode that I would argue is one of the most important episodes in terms of what it teaches to children.
You know, this is not how I thought my old friends would treat my new friends. If being cool is all you care about, maybe you should go find some new cool friends someplace else.
Something that isn't taught enough these days is cutting toxic people out of your life. Many grown adults seem to value their friends only in that they have friends, not how good those friendships are. The idea that cutting someone toxic out of your life is healthy for you isn't something that they can comprehend, and this episode just came out and nailed it, especially in regards to when people are being toxic to people other than yourself. Remember that Gilda doesn't scream at Rainbow, she loses it at Pinkie, and Rainbow cuts her out on principle. She doesn't try to remain friends with someone who abuses and harasses people like this, even when it isn't directed at her. She has too much respect for her real friends to do that, and it's something that people in both Rainbow's position and Pinkie's position need to hear. A friend of your abuser is no friend of yours. In real life, it's a lot more common to see people in Rainbow's position try to remain friends with both Pinkie and Gilda and not get involved in the drama. And that's a fucking shitty thing to do when one side is clearly in the wrong. And if you can't stick by a friend when they're abused or mistreated, then the friend you've let down is well within their right to cut you out. Compare and contrast to, well, the later seasons in general, where violent and hostile people are given dozens of second chances and abusive friends like Starlight continue to be allowed within the group.
Who said you could do that? No, Pony, I just did it.
That's the first indicator of a serial killer, you freak.
And in general, the idea of having less friends is considered worse than having only good friends. This resulted in the most hilarious form of hypocrisy in many of the characters, where in the early seasons, Trixie is vilified for being an arrogant, lying dickhead, but in the later seasons, Starlight is given hugs and cuddles and soft, soothing whispers in her ear after subjugating an entire town, mind-fucking them brainless, and enforcing her own fascist cult on the whole damn place. And I wasn't alone in noticing this, because throughout the entire series, Trixie was a fan favorite who everyone wanted to come back, but Starlight was the base-breaking character who a good 3/4 of even the adult fans hated. Her introduction was divisive, her redemption was divisive, her place in the main cast was divisive, and her consistent relapsing into abusive behavior remained a divisive thing. So it's not like people didn't completely care, but it was often treated as this unexplainable phenomenon with the show that couldn't possibly have a source. Of course, behind the scenes, the reason for such infuriating writing was twofold. See, the writers were clearly proud of Starlight and the general theme of later seasons. This is a trend in a lot of cartoons these days. Creators often have a very specific, centrist theme they want to push, especially onto children, and they tend to be dismissive of criticism, overly prideful of what they've made, react badly when it isn't accepted, and have a nasty habit of ignoring everyone on their staff telling them not to do what they're doing. The notion of creators trying, often in vain, to clap back against criticism tends to lay this pride bare. Episodes of Friendship is Magic, like Fame and Misfortune, were so nakedly obvious in this regard that to describe it as salt would be an understatement. See, it's one thing to make an episode parodying the imaginary idea of a show that your fanbase can cook up up in their heads, but to go out of your way to single out people with direct references, craft a scenario where you can have straw man characters repeat people's criticisms ad nauseum, and then try and write it all off with a musical number that says, "We have flaws, stop expecting us to improve as people," that always struck a chord with me, as it so brazenly mirrors the habit of performatively progressive people who say or do something stupid, get called out on it, and then make a big show about how cancel culture has gone too far, and the left is eating itself, rather than just admit you were wrong, commit to being better, and taking the temporary dragging like a grown-up. There's a defensiveness to shit like this that shows just how prideful a creator can often be, and how sensitive they are to that pride being wounded. It ultimately came down to the fact that the writers were proud of Starlight, and they didn't like it when people rejected her as a concept, so they double, triple, and quadruple down on Starlight and her critical overreaction issue that caused most of her problems in the first place, as if it were some kind of cute quirk. And while I fixate on Starlight because she's the most prominent example, it extended to every other antagonist as well. They all went through the exact same shit, except for Cozy Glow, who became the victim of the writers being edgy and stupid. Starlight's bullshit stretched further outward than that. If I could point to anything that was an absolute plague on the last decade, not just in animation, but the very concept of storytelling, it's this trend of absolutely monstrous, evil, nasty, completely unenjoyable antagonists who then turn around and go, "Oh, but I was sad once," and a bunch of mouth-breathing dipshits immediately showering their respective creators in tongue baths because OMG, so deep and complex, despite these characters being shallower than a fucking puddle. My Little Pony's biggest problem was that in its later seasons, it kept trying to appeal to adults, but it was My Little fucking Pony. It was never meant to appeal directly to adults. In fact, it gathered an adult fan base in the first place, despite never once considering trying to grab one. People act like this was some kind of surprise, but Friendship is Magic gathered a diverse audience because it was a funny, enjoyable show with fun characters and a good framework for delivering its stories. It doesn't matter if you're aimed at adults or if you're aimed at 5-year-olds, that's universally appealing. Which is why it's always baffled me that bronies by and large felt the need for the show to change in some way to more suit them, because why on earth were you watching the damn thing in the first place? Well, that's actually not a mystery. Back in season 1, the position of a lot of bronies was, "I don't like the show, but I love the fandom." It seems a lot of people jumped into a fandom for a show they didn't watch simply because of the idea of belonging to a community. A lot of people on the internet are lonely and seeking to be part of a group and aren't that good at building a social group of their own, so what ends up happening is a lot of them glom onto a fandom for anything and just go from there in the hopes of maybe making friends. For those of you wondering, this is why people get so emotionally attached to their fandoms that any kind of criticism of the work or creator is taken as a personal insult. Because these are people so emotionally stunted they will claim a fan of mediocre thing as a personality. And looking at the brony fandom of season 1, what were the big hits of fan works they were all championing back then? Past Sins, a story about Nightmare Moon being reincarnated as a child who was then adopted by Twilight. Cupcakes, a story about Pinkie Pie going batshit crazy and murdering her friends for no reason. And Fallout Equestria, a crossover between Fallout and My Little Pony that became popular for its ultra-violence and grim, moody tones. See, there's your problem, you got a bad case of the termites. People swiftly divided into their own cliques with their own interests, but that wasn't really what started the avalanche. Edgy fanworks exist everywhere, but it usually doesn't affect a work so severely. No, what really kicked things into high gear was the same thing we talk about all the time on this show: insecurity. See, back in 2011, right-wing news outlets had been short on things to pretend to be outraged about, and so very briefly focused on bronies and portraying them as basement-dwelling pedophiles, which back in season 1 was considered a ridiculous notion. Man, those were the days, weren't they? But bronies never really got over being the right-wing whipping boy of the moment, particularly because bronies tend to veer hard right, and the idea that right-wing media is a pit of opportunists and outrage peddlers couldn't really sink in with people who believe the same thing as they do, so the wound remained for a very long time, and bronies developed a very deep insecurity about liking a property for little girls, which translated into trying to muscle children out of the picture. Bronies by and large got so fucking histrionic that when a child posted a video about how bronies are dumb, a bunch of grown-ass men spent over a year crying about it and trying to humiliate this poor kid incessantly. You're probably thinking, Lily, this is about MLP, but you're talking about the fandom. Well, in the new 10s, you couldn't really separate them. The divide between creator and audience practically vanished once Twitter came into being, and it became possible to yell directly at executive producers. So not only were bronies getting news coverage, they were being noticed by the staff at Hasbro itself, and bronies were incessant in their demands for more villains, exploring the world, delving into the lore, and doing darker, more mature stories in general. But that desire didn't really catch on for a while because the people in charge kinda knew better. See, there's a divide between industry veterans who have been making cartoons since the 80s and 90s and young art school brats who are just now trying to make their magnum opus, and you can see the divide clear as day. Shows made by veterans tend to veer more toward even-tone storytelling and slice-of-life character interactions, while shows made by art school brats overwhelmingly lean toward pretensions of grand stakes and big worlds and Avatar-esque serialized storytelling. Hell, you can trace that back to fanfiction in the early 2000s. You ever notice that the most popular fanfics tend to be the ones that are really, really long, like 100,000 words or more? You also notice that the stories that get that long tend to drag incessantly and are constantly leaving the reader on cliffhangers to ensure they read the next chapter, which 99% of the time never fucking comes because the writer abandoned it years ago? You ever notice that we're having that problem with television now? This is why shows like The Loud House, Teen Titans Go, Hilda, and DC Superhero Girls tend to slant more toward overt comedy and don't take themselves very seriously, because they're made by people who know why the old shows of the 90s we all got hooked on got so popular, because they actually made them. Meanwhile, people who really liked Powerpuff Girls or Avatar or Teen Titans can often very rarely tell you the real reasons they were good, and what they tell you about those shows will often prove to be completely untrue upon investigation. So when you have a generation of people who grew up with Teen Titans and Avatar, fundamentally misunderstood them, and then went on to make their own shows despite only having an art degree, some minor animation experience, and no writing qualifications whatsoever, you get shows that are a bloody mess. And those bloody messes were cheered by other 90s kids for being OMG so deep, because they're not actually good at analyzing the merits of their own assholes, let alone a massive multimedia project. And when I talk about this, people get confused because you can't just walk into an executive's office and get a show deal. You need to go to school first, and school should hammer those bad habits out of you. But you remember how I said art school brats? See, you can be the world's greatest animator who can create Prince of Egypt level animation in record time on your own, but that doesn't mean you can make a show. You can go to school to learn animation, but if you're not also taking a literature course or a creative writing course or any kind of language arts course at all, then you're gonna have the same problem. Because it's not animation that causes shows like Steven Universe, Tangled, or Star vs. the Forces of Evil to nosedive into a miserable cliff. It's the writing. You can be a great animator, but if you can't write to save your life, you do not belong in the executive producer's chair. You should be in the art director's chair and leave executive producer to someone more qualified. What kept Friendship is Magic largely safe was the fact that for a while it was controlled by industry veterans. People Lauren Faust had worked with on previous projects were called on because she knew they were good at their jobs, and when she left they managed to keep everything under control. But after a few years, things started to change. Those experienced writers left, and the people who came on were fresh blood in the industry. Oh shit. All of a sudden, all the antagonists now have to be redeemed because the only options are redemption or death, and we can't kill them because that would be bad. Killing villains would be a bad lesson for children. Now here's an episode about how your depression isn't real and your parents who can't respect your boundaries and behave like adults should be tolerated because family. And suicide can be cured by small children going blah. You know, back in season 1, children were learning lessons like don't hound your friends for their stuff, or don't associate with people who treat your friends like shit, or don't be a pedantic asshole when one of your friends claims to have psychic powers, it's really not worth it, or don't look a gift horse in the mouth, but dumb tish. Well, now they're learning things like don't rock the boat too much, and don't cause conflict among your friends. Being friends even though you're hostile to each other is better than not being friends somehow. It's like bronies got a hold of the writing desk and started going hog wild with all their terrible ideas. And any pushback against this, the suggestion that maybe children shouldn't be taught these particular kinds of lessons, was given the usual canned response that anything else would be inappropriate for children. You ever wonder why the Powerpuff Girls reboot was so sterilized and packed to the gills with memes, despite the original being a hyper-violent action series? That's because the reboot was made by people who view age in a binary fashion and believe that the only two modes that exist for a show is Dora the Explorer and Game of Thrones, who believe they were making a show for 5-year-olds rather than a show for 7, 8, 9, and 10-year-olds. One common defense of Steven Universe, hang on, I won't be here long, I promise, is that they can't kill the villains because that's not appropriate for children. But Steven Universe isn't made for preschoolers, it's made for 10-year-olds. 10-year-olds can handle violence. Revenge of the Sith was considered appropriate for children, and that had a guy burning alive on camera, as well as the logical endpoint for any straight marriage. Yeah, my generation is really condescending toward children of all ages for no good reason whatsoever. We've never had a valid reason to think kids of any age under 16 are dumb and delicate and can't handle the basic realities of life. We just do it because we're idiots who don't bother to understand children. When trying to make something they themselves would enjoy, it's all about that world building and grand adventure and special connections, because despite being 30, my generation still thinks cooties exist. And I'm not saying that Friendship is Magic had to be teaching good lessons to kids, it just had to not teach bad lessons. Real talk, am I asking too much when I ask that children's cartoons remain entertaining to children and avoid teaching poor or toxic lessons? I don't think I'm asking for much. I'm not even asking for the shows to be good, just for them to not be terrible. I think I'm the only person left alive who talks about cartoons for a living who doesn't actually want the next Avatar. I would just prefer shows retain a bare minimum quality standard and maintain a bit of variety like we used to have. Like only 15 years ago, we could have a detective show, a parody of prison shows, a general slice of life show, a sitcom, an action spy cartoon, and whatever the hell Dave the Barbarian was supposed to be, all airing at the same time to give a variety of different types of stories. But it seems like this variety has been forgotten as my generation grew up and desperately chased Avatar like a fucking drug. Honestly, I'm really starting to wish that show had never fucking aired, because the damage it's done hasn't been worth it.